claim that globalization is coming to an end. What phenomena would you point out confirming such thesis?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a big debate about this, and one of the problems with globalization, it's very ephemeral. It's in the air, right? And it has no headquarters. It has no minister of globalization, so it's quite hard to pin down. What I do is I try and measure it in terms of its component parts. So, the flow of people, the flow of finance, the flow of trade, and all those were slowing before the COVID, and now COVID has basically knocked them all down. So in that respect, all the component parts of globalization are fading. Important things like collaboration between countries are also fading big time. So in the past, and this is, if a world is going to be interdependent, you need to have collaboration between countries and regions. And you don't have that anymore. I mean, that was the big disappointment of COVID, is that you had pretty much no collaboration between China, America, Europe and America, etc. And that, for me, is one of the tests that suggest that we're heading into a kind of a new world order now. And I would also say, in the past, I've kind of, you can measure it in lots of different ways. You can look at what companies are doing, and what big multinationals who've been the carriers of globalization, what they're doing is they're actually investing less abroad. Even though they want people in other countries to buy their goods, they're actually investing less in emerging markets than they used to.
Would it be possible to point out any particular moment of breaking the globalization?
Yeah, so
trend,
I think,
or was it just a gradual fade away?
It's a gradual thing, because it's like macro trends. What happens is that they, big macro trends, they grow and they move along until they start to create side effects, and these side effects themselves cause aggravation. So, for example, the trade war is one event, but things like climate change, which is, climate change hasn't happened with any one event, but we're getting more events now that remind us of climate change, be it fires in Siberia or Australia. Inequality is another one, which doesn't really have anything to do with globalization, because some of the most open economies in the world are very globalized, but they don't have inequality because they use tax policy, for example, to offset that and redistribute.
2016, the election of Donald Trump is probably one of the phenomena that is actually a result of the failures of globalization. How would you describe coming into that situation?
So I would describe it less as a failure of globalization, but a failure by America to distribute the benefits of globalization. Because when he was elected, there was this kind of mythologized community of people who so-called, and it's actually, it's right that they feel they've been left behind. In America, all the benefits of globalization have been concentrated in big multinationals, and in the big metropolitan cities, Boston, New York, Silicon Valley, for example. So there was a failure to use tax policy, whatever else, to redistribute the benefits of globalization. And that, I think, certainly led to his election. Yeah. I don't think Biden will drastically change America, which is a worry in itself. I think he'll kind of restore the old order. So I'm not wholly convinced of that either. And I think many of the things that are erupting in America will continue.
So if I understand correctly, the old elites are coming back to power, and probably the reasons for Trump being elected like 4 years ago were not really being properly taken care of. Yeah,
they haven't been solved. Yeah, that's and actually they've been made worse because America is actually more unequal now than it was. So that's true. So I think all that is true, and I think Biden's got a very good foreign policy team, but it's not as clear as to who his economics team will be, and that's a concern, because that's the area they need to work most on. So I think a Biden presidency will actually do well to repair relations with other countries, but I'm not sure that they have a team in place yet to radically change its economy.
Can you point out to any similar situation of globalizational trends to reverse in history of our civilization?
Absolutely. So there's a very clear example. So we're in the second wave of globalization. The first one was from 1870 to 1912, and that was also a time of great stock market rallies, new technologies like steamships, railways, for example. So we had it all before. It was a time of great consumerism as well. And again, it ended badly because, the world order was different then, but you had the outbreak of trade wars, you had the buildup of debt, you had the massive military buildup, very expensive military buildup leading up to the First World War. And that kind of broke the system. And there were many people at the time who said, the globalization is too powerful and people have invested too much in it for them to go to war. And of course they did in the end. Yeah.
How to manage the transition from the old ways of doing business to the new? Have you given it any thought, like both on a micro level as well as the policy making
I have. So I think whenever you get, one of these big kind of tectonic changes, you first of all have to try and not to deny it and not stick to the old system. It's a bit like getting, I'm not old yet, but I'm sure it's a bit like getting old. You can't run as fast as you used to. So you just have to accept it that, that period has passed. And then there's usually a period of, say, 5 or 10 years that looks quite chaotic and new things are being formed. And you just have to accept that we go through that for the next 5 or 10 years. And I think, and maybe say two more things. One, the world we're going into is a kind of a multipolar world dominated by 3 large regions who will do things increasingly differently. China, Europe, and America. And also, I think a lot of the institutions of the World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, IMF, either need to be changed radically or need to be pared down and new institutions allowed to creep up, because it's just clear that they're not doing. It's a bit like driving a car from the 1990s. It'll still go on the road, but it's not as nice or as fast as other cars. It doesn't work as well.
In what way do you see the modes of operation of these 3 superpowers will be different?
So the way I would compare it is that in the early part of globalization, let's say we had the internet. The internet was global, and Google, for example, had 30% of the Chinese search market share. Now it has close to 0. So we go from a world where there was kind of one way of doing things. It was kind of the American way, and emerging market countries were happy to follow that approach or that template. And now we're going into a world where there may be different competing ways of doing things in Europe, China, and America. And each of those are driven by different values. So I'll give you 2 examples. One is the internet. Europe now, its role is to protect its citizens, so it regulates the internet. The US has got these huge internet companies that have become kind of stock market monsters. And then China has closed off its internet, but it has a vibrant e-commerce sector. So that's one way it's kind of changing. And if you look at how each region has handled COVID, in Europe, we had a shaky start, but generally there's been a reliance on social welfare systems, keeping people in work, a sense of solidarity, and that's worked okay. Healthcare systems have been all right. China has been very, very harsh in terms of their original lockdown. They haven't been clear either on information and where the virus has come from. And they've also been trying to get the economy back as quickly as possible. And then the States has been a much more balanced debate between the economy and the healthcare issues. And America will lose about 250,000 people, which is astounding,
In one of the interviews I saw online, you've mentioned we're sort of heading slowly into some new ways of doing business. But for now, when we go back to our desks at work, we're still doing the old thing.
Yeah.
How do you see this kind of a transition?
So that's true. And the obvious tension is the whole thing of working from home, right?
Yeah.
So I think our lives will change. And one way they'll change for the better is in healthcare. People will be more aware of sanitation, of their health, of their fitness, maybe, and maybe of their mental fitness as well, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that people, in many countries, people will, I hope, reflect on the state and the government, what the state is there for. And
Mm-hmm.
in most cases, certainly in Europe, the state has helped people. It's been a positive factor. And then I think, companies have to change because lots of companies still operate in very old, efficient ways. They want to control people. So I think workers will have a lot more freedom, which is good for the way you work. I'm not sure if it's going to be good for their income because a more atomized kind of workforce, if anything, gross wages will actually might fall as a result of that.
What about the policy-making side of these tectonic changes? You have mentioned central banks having lead roles, etc.
So I think there's a few things going on. I think, generally speaking, policymakers have reacted really quickly. Mm-hmm. They did in a month what took 2 years, 10 years ago. I think most governments are still in kind of emergency mode. And they're not really thinking about, they're thinking more about the next 2 months than the next 2 or 10 years in terms of where growth is going to be.
Yeah.
And I also think then the big factor are central banks who, I disagree with how aggressive central banks have been for the last 10 years in terms of using their balance sheets. And then they've gone and doubled that. And I think it clearly creates kind of recklessness and risk-taking in markets. It means debt levels are so high, asset prices are high. So there'll be a quid pro quo for all this in the future, and that young people trying to build up pensions or people trying to save will be at a disadvantage. And many countries are now massively indebted as a result of this.
Do you see inflation picking up as the next way of taxing people?
Yeah, so I don't think, I don't think inflation is going to pick up because I don't think that people are really ready to pay more money for, a loaf of bread or whatever. And in my view, inflation is not rising prices. It's people are prepared to pay higher prices and they have higher wages as well. And the last 10 years, we've seen, a period of steady recovery, lots of monetary support, no inflation, very little wage growth. So we have massive unemployment. I'm not sure we're going to see that. What we will see, I think, is just continued asset price inflation. Because a lot of the monetary stimulus from central banks is clearly going into markets. So it is misdirected in that sense. And that will create a problem because, if financial market inflation rises and soft commodity prices rise, or, look at lumber prices, then people pay more for their goods. And if they're not getting wage increases, then they're worse off, right?
What do you think about the inflation as a measure itself, how it's constructed? It seems to me that it used to be more useful as a guide for an economic policy than it's been recently.
Yeah, I think
Is it sort of distorted? Because on the other hand, as you mentioned, there bubbles picking up every so often in various different markets. Doesn't make any sense to me.
I mean, it's a tough one. I think I don't personally have a problem with measures of inflation. I mean, they're backward looking. They don't cover everyone's kind of basket. The biggest problem, I think, in many cases, they don't cover housing costs very well, or they don't cover housing affordability. So that's the big issue. That's the biggest thing people spend money on. But I haven't seen better competing measures, quite frankly. And bear in mind there's a big technological effect as well of kind of the digital or the e-commerce sector that should be pushing down the price of goods as well.
The possible directions for the next world order, or the world order that we're going into, probably seems to be requiring a shift from a short-term to longer-term orientation of the policy goals without any meaningful changes in our political systems. How do you see that shift?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, actually. And again, many governments have the excuse of kind of
everybody's sort of incentivized to see things in a short-term view, and nothing
they
seems
are
to,
exactly. I actually think that countries who have a very long-term outlook, so maybe Switzerland, most of them are small countries, Abu Dhabi, Switzerland, Singapore, I hope they will be rewarded for that. And I think, what really worries me is that there are all these long-term problems that are just getting worse, like climate change, indebtedness, etc. And there's just a lack of focus on them, and unless there is an emergency of some sort, which is not a satisfactory situation at all, actually.
Do you see any changes in going to that situation?
So what are the ways in which that would come about? So I think you probably need political leadership, and there are not many good examples of that now. You need new institutions for new problems. We don't have that right away. So I actually think that the next big issue will be indebtedness in about 4 years' time. If the world economy is not really strong by then, the level of indebtedness will begin to weigh on the system. And that would become quite problematic, actually, and you see big debt restructuring and that kind of thing. The ways to get out of indebtedness are to grow. So there's a question mark over that. Inflation, again, question mark. And then the other one would be restructuring. And what's interesting is that in 1924, after the first wave of globalization, the First World War, etc., you had a huge world debt conference where France and Britain forgave Germany its debt, and then they went to America and said, "Can you forgive us our debt?" And in the book, I've kind of come up with a slightly stylized example of that, where you have massive debt restructuring. And I think, for me, debt, given that there's so much legacy debt in the world, debt is becoming a kind of a handbrake on growth. Because if a company or a private equity owner of a company has got massive leverage, all they're trying to do is just to pay off the interest to maybe pare down some of the outstanding debt. They're not running the company and investing in it to grow, so that creates its own kind of problems.
Would you agree that the key issue into getting the right direction going forward is that we need to sort of have to start talking about our own failures? How to do that in the environment of present modes of communication, like mass media, social networks, which are constructed in the way sane discussions are ever more difficult to hold.
Yeah.
How do you see any way out? I mean,
so I think it's a very interesting point. So I think that the political sort of social media environment is a very difficult one because lots of people are saying lots of nasty things.
Yeah.
So
and the communication system is incentivizing them doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you kind of ask yourself, who would ever become a politician? And sometimes in a crowded room, I ask people, and most of them will be successful business people. I say, would you be a politician? They all put their heads down. Because it's not just is it nasty, but it's very, very difficult to operate in. So I think there's a few ways of doing it. So I think one idea would be for the European Union to have a kind of closed doors post-mortem on the COVID crisis and say, well, what did we do? What did some countries do right? What did others do wrong? And, we're probably not going to have another big health crisis, but what can we learn from this if there's a geopolitical crisis or if we need to, so something like that, I think would be interesting. And I think it would have to be behind closed doors, because if it's in the public light, then people say different things and behave very, very differently. And it should be done in a spirit of kind of openness and etc. The second thing that I've actually begun to discover is that there are an increasing number of examples of people using social media in a constructive way. And what you can do with social media is you can use filtering to filter away kind of negative commentary. There are at NYU now, they have a thing on crowd laws. So you use crowds on social media to try and construct, let's say, a constitution for a new country or a kind of a new law or something like that. And I think that's quite interesting because it gets the essence of people's opinions on something and collates it. So I think that's actually quite good. And with, all parts of Europe, from Slovenia to Ireland in mind, all the talk at the moment on European values, I actually think that one interesting exercise to do would be to use social media to get just ordinary people's views on what are European values, right? Because someone in Poland's got a very different idea of European values to someone in the west of France. But there has to be a kind of a middle ground,
Elites versus masses, and increasing inequality. What to do about the inequality?
Yeah. So I think there are we shouldn't confuse elites with people in power and governance, because there are examples in, say, Estonia, Finland, of kind of, and Denmark, young female prime ministers who 20 years ago were working at the counter of a shop or something like that. Now, those countries are very, very equal.
I'm sorry, I meant elites in the sense of political corruption.
Yeah, yeah.
The USA, you have two parties. They have these games every 4 years. The winner gets to sell its institutional positions to the highest bidder. Special interests. How to break this cycle?
Yeah. So my book is partly about this one chapter on kind of political entrepreneurship, and the sad thing is that many people who are idealistic about politics and want to change things, they don't succeed, maybe because they're not cynical enough, or they don't kind of capture the system, or they're too much outside the system. And that's why I think Macron is interesting, that he's a sort of system insider, and he's hijacked the system from the inside with the help of lots of people. So I think there's a few things to bear in mind. One is that if you want to change the system, you have, unless you're prepared to be really radical and have a violent revolution, you need to come in towards the center of it. The second thing is, I think technology is really interesting, because social media is definitely changing politics for the worst, but also in in countries where you have a lot of corruption, social media is increasingly, Kenya as an example, increasingly being used in things like social security systems, monitoring of government finances to reduce corruption. So I actually think that you will have more people who will be convinced that the role of technology in politics is really important from a point of view of transparency. So that's one thing, and that's one growing trend. A free press, which is, you look at Belarus or even France, which is very limited in terms of free press, for example. So I think that's one of the great things about countries like England or Ireland, is that the press is very, very free. And then then I think you need to be able to find. It's a bit like going from setting up a startup to a real business, because if I look at America, there are lots of little startup protest movements, and frankly, if all they're going to do is smash up shops, then they have no chance of success, and they don't deserve it either. So you have to be able to take energy and anger and translate it into a tangible political goal or manifesto, and then map out a way to try and achieve that. And I think many people, it's a different skill set. That's why many people fail, actually.
You have mentioned that perhaps standing back a bit and figuring out about the drivers to grow organically would be the best way going forward. Is still the case, as you see it?
Yeah, so I think one of the issues in big economies in the last 10 years is that sort of organic economic growth, trend growth is actually slowing. And the obvious measure of that is productivity. So productivity in the States has slowed. Productivity in the UK is the lowest it's been in like a century. And that's a symptom of lots of things: demographics, education, investment in education, investment in research. So many different things. And to compensate for the decline in productivity and growth, that's why you have central banks doing all the QE. It's why you have governments taking on all this debt, for example.
You see an important driver to break that into a positive direction, like more investment in innovation, or
I do. So I think
where do you see the kind of groups of instruments?
Yeah, so I think there has to be debate really on kind of growth and what are its drivers. And I'm biased, and Slovenia is probably a good example of this as well. But the countries who've best cracked this kind of puzzle of organic growth and where does it come from are kind of small dynamic economies: Netherlands, Sweden, etc. And they're all quite different, but they do similar things. So very clear rule of law, training, education, giving incentives for innovation and allowing innovation to take place and to thrive. So it's that kind of mix. And it's becoming more and more rare, actually. And that I think is what the developed countries of the world need to begin to do.
In terms of green policies, I've heard, I don't know if you know him, Bjorn Lomborg, the Danish environmentalist. He's pretty critical about how money is presently used to go green. He said that without breakthroughs, technological breakthroughs, that we're not going to achieve any meaningful goals in terms of avoiding the planet warming up. And he said that if only a part of money used for a lot of subsidies would be redirected to innovations, that would probably be a much better way going forward. What do you think?
I generally agree with it. It's a question as well. I mean, I think in Europe, in many European countries, the incentives to innovate are not very high. So If you're a German innovator, you're not allowed, you're taxed if you take your innovation out of Germany. In France, tax rates on entrepreneurs are still high. And I think also legacy businesses like fossil fuels are probably not given a disincentive to stop what they're doing and to innovate in other areas. So I generally agree with them. I'm 100% behind the environmental cause, but I'm not an environmental scientist, so I can't comment with great precision or authority on any of this.
How will coronavirus influence globalization ending, in your view?
So, I mean, it's killed it off because the components of globalization are things like travel and trade, movement of people. So they've all been killed off, and when they come back, they'll be very different. I also think it's been an interesting exercise in that everyone has kind of gone back home to their own country or their adopted country, and they've stayed there for for months. So it's made people more aware of the local and of the national, I think, rather than the global. Again, we haven't had this collaboration that you need between nations, which I think is quite a pity, quite sad. So I think this, for me, reinforces what has been taking place already in terms of the transition from globalization to a multipolar world.
Do you see values are going to change in a profound way after this event?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are clear positives. I mean, I think the fact that so many billions of people were able to patiently isolate themselves for their own sake and for the sake of others is actually, it's a great positive for humanity, I think. And to do so, from in an unprecedented circumstance. So that's positive. I think the big positive is that we're more aware of healthcare and of public services. So I think the sense that public goods, you need good public goods, I think that has been reinforced in many countries. And then in emerging countries where you have things like urbanization, I think they need to incorporate these new lessons into that and maybe design cities, transport systems a little bit differently. So I think all those are positives. Does it reinforce values? So probably it does reinforce a sense of, I mean, I'm being idealistic now, responsibility, a sense of the state. I mean, you'll see in Ireland, for example, there's been a huge political scandal over something that many people consider to be quite small, which is attending a dinner. But the background to that is just that, so many people have sacrificed so much, and then when their leaders are not prepared to do it, you need accountability. So I think ultimately that's a positive thing, and that it's brought greater accountability, I think.